say, when I speak at this podium, I always feel as though I have to stand on tiptoe. I don't think it's designed for people who are only 5'3", or am I 5'4"? Well, perhaps, who knows. I seem to be the first speaker by default, but I'm absolutely delighted to be here, needless to say. And thank you, Barry, for your very kind introduction. And as Barry's indicated, I should be concentrating on what I see as our economic prospects after Brexit, assuming there is, of course, a Brexit vote, which I fervently hope for. Far too often we hear the Remainers, and I call them the Remainers, say that we Brexiters don't give a clear enough vision as to what it would be like, or we're always disagreeing about what that vision should be. Unfortunately, I think they've actually got a point there, but I'm hoping to cast a little bit of light on things tonight. Suffice to say, I'm with Barry. I want to leave the EU basically because I want to live in a self-governing democracy. The economics are important, but for me it's far more important to be in a democratic country. And what gets me is that most of the countries on this planet are self-governing. Some are less democratic than others, but let's leave that on one side. And what I can never understand about the Remainers is they don't seem to appreciate that this country couldn't cope outside the EU. It couldn't, in other words, have the same relationship as a country like Canada or Australia or India. I just find it absolutely staggering. Why shouldn't we have a similar sort of system to the countries actually we gave independence to? I just don't understand it, but there we go. I must say the Remainers seem to have very, very, very little confidence in this country's ability to govern itself, which I find really rather pathetic, but there we go. And I must say, the other thing I find with the Remainers is when they say, well, you tell us exactly what's going to be like. My reaction to that is, okay, you tell me exactly where the EU will be in 5 years' time. What about the migration crisis? Actually, you don't know what the migration crisis is going to be like in 5 weeks' time. Never mind 5 years' time. Who knows whether this current arrangement will hold or not? Who knows? You don't know, and I don't know. And when it comes to the Eurozone, I was actually rather pleased when Mervyn King, the former governor of the Bank of England, chipped in recently about this and said the Eurozone was basically a doom to failure. He said, at last, there is somebody who reminds us that the Eurozone crisis might have gone quiet, it might have gone quiescent, but my goodness me, the crisis has not gone away. And for a lot of the countries within the Eurozone, all the euro does is actually bring them permanent misery, high unemployment, and recession. Greece is particularly in that position. So, I don't know, what could we say to them? When it comes to Brexit, I think there are obviously going to be several aspects to the campaign as we go through. Obviously, the control of the borders is an important one. Security is another one, not least of all because of today's tragic developments, and the economy. But I was interested in a poll that was taken after Cameron's great deal. I was going to think of a polite word that I don't wish to embarrass people by using bad language, but the Prime Minister's deal with the European Union in February, which as Jacob Morgan described as thing rule. And there was a survey, a Comres survey in the Daily Mail soon after that. And people were asked on 4 key issues whether they thought we'd be better off in or better off out of the EU. And I think the results were very, very telling. When it came to immigration, there was no doubt in people's minds we'd be better off out, so we'd have control over our borders. When it came to security, they weren't too sure. Perhaps a slight majority thought we'd perhaps be better off in, but it wasn't a very big margin. When it came to democracy, again, no problems. We'd be better off out. So democracy we've got in the bag, immigration we've got in the bag, security is comme ci, comme ça. A bit of French, I thought. I'd sort of liven the evening with a bit of French. But it was a bit comme ci, comme ça. But the economy, there was a big majority of people who thought we were better in the EU. They had bought the scare tactics. They bought Project Fear, that somehow there'd be a loss of trade, a loss of investment, and a loss of jobs. And really, I think, back again to Barry's introductory remarks, it's our job to say that, in fact, the impact, even the near-term impact of Brexit, would be fairly small. And by the way, I was delighted to see a report by Moody's that today, I don't know if any of you saw it on the BBC website, but Moody's, this is one of the credit rating agencies, said that the near-term impact was likely to be small and there wouldn't be that much impact on jobs or even on interest rates. And I thought at last a bit of common sense as to what would actually happen. Whereas, of course, recently, over the last two weeks, we've had at least 3 reports from various august economic bodies saying how shocking it would be if we left. Namely, the CBI, our old friends. They deserve to be laughed at, I'm sorry, but there we go. The London School of Economics, the Centre for Economic Performance, and Oxford Economics. And I look at the assumptions behind all those reports, and they just make me tired. They're so unrealistic. And let's just remind ourselves that with the LSE CEP, that's the Centre for Economic Policy, and the CBI, they are absolutely gung-ho for Britain joining the euro. And I remember in particular, this is in my IRD days, I mean, I wasn't particularly politically motivated by this, and I mean that quite sincerely, folks. But no, I was looking at the economics of it and said, joining the euro, that means you lose all your monetary control, all your fiscal control, you lose your economic control. This is not a good idea. And I used to debate this with various luminaries from the CBI, and they'd say, oh, but Ruth, if we were in the euro, we'd have stability. In other words, there'd be no change in the exchange rate. And I used to say, well, if you've got the same exchange rate, of course there's no change in the exchange rate. That'd be absurd. But of course, you'd still fluctuate against all the other exchange rates in the world. And then I said, you know what it sounds like to me? It sounds like rigor mortis. And they didn't like my rubbishing of their wonderful construct, but I'm afraid to say, oh, I'm so modest. I wouldn't say this if I weren't right, so I've said it because I was right. But on to the point of our relationship with the EU if Brexit. There's an awful lot of energy spent as to whether it should be the Norwegian option, whether it should stay in the EEA. Mind you, we wouldn't stay in the EEA. If we left the EU, we would leave the EEA because our membership of the EEA, which comprises the EU plus Iceland, Liechtenstein and Norway, depends on our EU membership. I think that's fairly clear. The Norwegian option, should we have that? Or should we have the Swiss option with all the bilaterals? And the Swiss have got a lot of bilaterals with the EU. Or should we have the Canadian option, which is basically a rather souped-up trade agreement, but basically an independent country? Or the Turkish option, stay within the customs union, or Flexit, or whatever, or whatever, or whatever. Frankly, I think all this is a bit of a distraction, because we're not Norway, we're not Switzerland, we're not Canada, we're not Turkey. These are all splendid countries, but we're Britain, and we're noticeably a bigger and more influential country than any of those countries, and we should be able to negotiate our own relationship with the EU. Or if we can't, we may as well pack up and go home. And of course, basically, if Brexit, we'd be under the WTO trading rules, and then with whatever deal we agreed with the EU. And that deal, in detail, is not for me to say, it's not for you to say, it's what the government at the end of the day will negotiate. And now this brings me on to where the government is, because the Prime Minister has said that if there's a Brexit vote on the 23rd of June, and we'll all be dancing in the street, if we're still able to stand up, that is, the Prime Minister, he said that he will trigger Article 50, which is the withdrawal clause, straight away, pretty well. And then we have up to 2 years to negotiate a new arrangement, as it said, under Article 50. Now, this 2 years can be extended if the European Council agrees to it. But let's, for a sake of argument, say it's 2 years. Now, I accept the fact that that's quite a short period of time. And I would hope and pray that the government at the moment, not least of all the Foreign Office and the Treasury and the Department for Business, is actually working out some contingency plans now as to what sort of deal they would have. After all, I was a civil servant for several years, more years than I care to remember, actually. But before a general election, there would always be contingency plans in case there was a change of government. And I hope, I do pray, that they're doing those contingency plans now. And if anybody is one of our legislators, looking at nobody in particular, David, perhaps they would be asking questions in the House as to whether the government is making those contingency plans, because, my goodness me, they should be doing. So let's say a little bit more about the WTO and then what I think about any trade deal with the EU. The WTO, as I said, is a default option. If we left and there was no deal with the EU, we would trade under those rules. We'd take on all the rights and responsibilities of WTO membership again, and after all, we were one of the founder members of its predecessor, GATT, way back in the late 1940s. And we'd have to trade under one of the rules is the non-discriminatory rules. So if you have tariffs of X against one country, they'd have to be the same against another, unless there was a trade agreement with that other countries. Now, the next thing to say about that is that that'd be fine. It wouldn't be a disaster, because at least a third of the trade is estimated, the global trade, is actually just under WTO rules. And of course, as tariffs come down year by year, or at least they tend to drift down, actually having a special deals becomes less and less important for goods. Much, much less important than it was 20, 30, 40 years ago when tariffs were quite high. And indeed, if you look at a country when we're negotiating sort of big trade with China, it's quite obvious that trade basically under the WTO rules can be extremely successful. You only have to look at the numbers. If you compare Anglo-Chinese trade with, over the last decade, with Anglo-EU trade, then our Anglo-Chinese trade has grown several times faster than our trade with the EU. In other words, what tends to drive the trade is not so much whether you're in any single market or the customs union or whatever, it is actually commercial reality. Do people have goods you want to buy? If so, you'll buy them. And do people want goods you can sell? If so, you can sell them. And it doesn't really matter what country you're in. And it's interesting that how many times have you heard that, oh dear, if we're not in the single market, we won't have full access to the single market. We'll have to pay. Oh, goodness me. Oh, please, we want to sell things to you. Please maybe give you some money so that we can sell things to you. It's absolute nonsense. Of course it is. Does China pay? Does China have access to the markets? Of course it does. I'm afraid all this sort of stuff about being locked out of markets is scaremongering of the most disgraceful kind. And then, of course, but you'd have to comply with the regulations. Well, if a British exporter exports to the United States of America now, you have to comply with the product regulations. You have to comply with their customs procedures. If a Chinese exporter exports to us, they have to comply with EU regulations, product regulations, and they have to get through the customs procedures. That's what exporters do. And if they don't, well, they don't export. Or put it this way, they don't export successfully. And so this idea that you'd be awfully, it's be so difficult and impossible, oh, for goodness sake, it really is just such a complete red herring. We know that, and we've got to convince all these people out there who get frightened by this sort of talk that it really is utter and complete nonsense. So there we are. WTO, if that's what we ended up with, it's not the end of the world. Trade would go on, and the more the merrier, so to speak. But we would face the common external tariff from the European Union. I don't think there's any doubt about that. And on the whole, it tends to be very low now. And of course, it's just on goods, and about 40% of our exports in goods and services is actually now services. Services are a very, very important part of our export trade. But it tends to be low, the average common external tariff, but there are certain industries, like the car industry, where it's actually quite high. It's nearly 10%. And I think for British car exporters, they really would want some sort of trade agreement. And also there is something called passporting within the City of London, which means that if you're registered in one of the regulatory authorities in the EU, then you can, hello, somebody's waving, then you can, then you can trade throughout the EU. Now, to sort of continue with those passporting rules would be probably useful. So there would be advantages to having a trade agreement or some sort of agreement like that. I wouldn't just discount it. I know some people do just discount it, but I don't. Then the question is whether they, in other words, the rest of the European Union, would be prepared to have a trade agreement with us. And they say, oh, but we're only little, you know. I mean, the EU exports to the UK are only about 3 or 4% of their GDP, whereas our exports to the EU are about 10 or 15% of ours. Therefore, we'd be in such a weak position to negotiate a trade agreement. Oh, for goodness sake, it's so lame. You know, last year, when the goods deficit we had with the EU was £89 billion. That's just a little bit more than George Osborne's borrowing requirement for this year, which will probably come in at about 75 billion. But, you know, having been a Treasury civil servant, these numbers don't really mean anything. It's just ridiculous. But 89 billion is a lot of exports. So say that we have a trade deficit with the EU of 89 billion. That was last year, 2015. With Germany, and rumour has it that Germany is quite an influential country in the EU. In other words, it calls the shots, and I didn't say that. We actually have a trade deficit of goods of over £31 billion. 31 billion, so 1.5% of our GDP. That's probably about 1.25% of German GDP. Do you think for one second, and this is a rhetorical question, if anybody says yes, I'll throw them out. Do you think for one second that the German car exporters would say, oh, you've left the EU, we're not going to sell you our products anymore? Of course the answer is no. Moreover, they push very hard for a trade agreement because they wouldn't want to face whatever tariffs we put up against the EU. That's assuming we would put tariffs up, and I think we probably would. So I could see the German car exporters pushing hard for a deal. And so would the German government. The German government is a very mercantilist-minded government. They wouldn't want to see their exports suffering in any particular way. And under those circumstances, not merely would there be a trade agreement, but I think they'd get on with it pretty rapidly, because they would not want any disruption, any major disruption to their exports if Brexit. After all, what's not to like? They'd want to get on with it. And all this palaver about going on, taking 5 years, 10 years, or God knows how many years, I just think is commercial nonsense. When people say those things to me, I say, think of the commercial realities. Don't think of the scaremongering, just think of the commercial realities. Now, of this sort of relationship, I make 3 points. And I've heard, actually, a certain Foreign Secretary make exactly the opposite points. That's why I'm making these 3 points. For a start, I wouldn't expect the government to negotiate free movement of people. I think that this agreement would really be about goods and services. And by the way, the other leg of the single market, goods and services, capital and labour, well, capital, of course, is decided globally. It's not an EU thing. We have free movement of capital with the United States of America. In fact, they're the biggest investor in this country, as indeed we are the biggest investor in the US. Come on, you know we are a global economy, a big global economy. So, but I wouldn't expect any government to negotiate free movement of people, because, after all, one of the big things, the biggest concerns is to get control over the borders. And that would rule out completely the Norwegian option. And it would also rule out the sort of bilateral agreement that Switzerland has. And Switzerland has got a bilateral agreement on the free movement of people. And the second thing is, I've already hinted about regulations. Yes, of course, we'd have to comply with product standards, but we wouldn't have to go along with all their regulations unless we wanted to. I mean, does China adopt the Working Time Directive, for goodness sake? Of course it does. It's just piffle. I get so cross, you know. And thirdly, we wouldn't contribute to the EU budget because we would not be a member. Norway and Switzerland contribute to various projects and initiatives in the EU, which we could do. We could do if we thought they were worthwhile. But those countries do not contribute to the EU budget. They are not members. So let's put all that together and say that if Brexit, we had our vote on the 23rd of June, Article 50 was triggered very quickly, then within 2 years, we'd go. And providing there was that trade agreement, which I'm sure would happen, I can't see very much disruption. And I think Moody's assessment that the near-term impact would be small is accurate. And all the scaremongering is just scaremongering. But of course, looking ahead, once we were out of the EU, we would be in a position to actually take advantage of our freedom, our economic freedom, the sort of freedom that Canada has or Australia has and other such like-minded countries. We would be able to amend or repeal the most irksome business regulations we don't like. We would be able to negotiate trade deals with third countries, which we can't do at the moment because we're in the EU's customs union. And a customs union, of course, is when you have a common external tariff, but free trade within. Free trade agreement is when you have a free trade within, but you can choose your own external tariff. And we could decide whether we wanted to trade with Australia, Canada. Well, Canada's got an agreement, but Australia hasn't, New Zealand hasn't. Or the United States of America. Of course, the United States of America is struggling to negotiate agreement with the US at the moment, but there are all sorts of delays because of various sensitivities. And I'm sure if we went ahead and wanted to do those trade agreements, we could push them through much quicker than the EU could. Because the EU is 28 countries, all with different ambitions and all with different sensitivities. And it's interesting to note that EFTA, which is just the 4 countries, the Norway, Liechtenstein, Iceland and Switzerland, they can push through their trade agreements quicker than the EU can for the simple reason they're relatively small, relatively homogenous, and they just get on with it. And interesting enough, by the way, the EU's trade agreements are more extensive than the EFTA's trade agreements are more extensive than the EU's, and they're a much better fit for our trade. And when I've heard say, oh, but we're too small. Oh, I can't bear this, I really can't bear it. We're too small to do our own trade agreements. We haven't got the people to do them. Oh. Iceland has a trade agreement with China. Switzerland has a trade agreement with China and one with Japan. And if we needed people to do those agreements, we could soon get them in. We have a Canadian governor of the Bank of England, for goodness sake. Why not get a few Canadians in? And there must be Brits in the Commission and in the WTO in Geneva who know about trading agreements. Or get the Swiss in, or get the Icelanders in. I mean, it is just so pathetic when I hear criticisms like that. So we could do our own trade agreements, and it's worth reminding ourselves, as if we don't know, that actually the EU is now a relatively declining part of the world economy. You know, back in 1980, it comprised 30% of the world GDP. It's now more like 17, and it will inexorably decline because its relative growth rates are so poor. And the demographics in a lot of the countries just exacerbate the situation. Truth is, the growth markets are not in the EU anymore. They're relatively sluggish, they're mature, the growth markets are out there across the sea. So being able to negotiate one's own agreements is a very, very big plus. And of course, thirdly, on the immigration, and I said I wouldn't discuss this very much, but outside the EU we could decide our own immigration policy and have a non-discriminatory policy, something like an Australian point system, where the person applying to come in came from India or Australia or Canada or Colombia or Eastern Europe. They'd all be equally equal in front of the particular point system. Could be non-discriminatory, which I think would be a very big plus. And of course, finally, just another little sort of the icing on the top of the cake would be that we would be able to save on our contributions. And at the moment, in 2014, the contributions were 19 billion gross. After the rebate, there were 14 billion. And even after the rebate and the public sector receipts, there was still 10 billion. And actually, that would be quite useful in trying to fill the public borrowing gap. Although you'd still have 65 billion to go, but at least 10 billion is a start. So, all in all, I can see us getting through that Brexit phase without too much disruption. And thereafter, without getting too sort of starry-eyed about it, provided we had a government that could take advantage of the new freedoms, our prosperity and our prospects, I think, could be so much better. Has someone arrived? Barry?
It doesn't look as if somebody's arrived. Robert,
they'll be here in 5 minutes.
5 minutes? I think I'll conk out before then. I'm just trying to pad my speech out.
I can get the audience to ask you some questions.
Yes. Well, I will finish my speech in that case. So, having said all that, 5 minutes, all right, 5 minutes, fair enough. I'm sorry, I've not finished yet. I say we could have our own trade deals, which is all very splendid. And the other thing I would recommend is that we rejoin EFTA. And again, we were a founder member of EFTA back in 1957. And that would actually mean that we get back into a trade agreement with Norway and Switzerland, that are two of our larger partners. And then, what was that? Oh, well. I will actually draw it to close and then I'll take questions, but I just want to sort of wrap up with a sort of rather a personal reflection on the EU. I remember it only too well when we joined in 1973, and I was a civil servant at the time. And I did support membership, believe it or not, so don't sort of assassinate me on the way out. I've seen the light since then. But we remember it. For those of us who do remember the 1970s well, the country was horrendously demoralised. As Dean Asherson said, we've lost an empire, not yet found a role. Well, thank you, special relationship. And we'd seen Germany rise phoenix-like, the great wunderkind, from the ashes of the Second World War. And we just didn't seem to be doing very well. And of course, the tariffs at that time were reasonably high, so it seemed to make some economic sense, although it was not that convincing at the time, that in fact, joining the Six, as they were at the time, was probably a sensible thing to do. But let's be honest, that was over 40 years ago, and the world has changed dramatically since then. I've already sort of described some of the problems of the European Union, and boy, they're not going to get better. And in the meantime, I think this country has really picked up its bounce, again, its enthusiasm for life, if I may say so. And again, as we said, the EU, or the EEC as it was, may have appeared to be the future, our future, back in 1973, and it seemed to be the right modern thing to do. But I know this, it isn't like that anymore. Let's be frank about this, chaps, it's time to leave.
Thank you very much indeed for that excellent analysis, Ruth. And now I'll move to questions. Could I have a question from the gentleman there? Glasses? Could you just stand up so people can hear you?
I wonder whether Dr. Lee cared to comment on the effect on the European Union
Keep going. The effect on the European Union of...
if we decide to leave.
The question is, what will be the effect on the European Union if we decide to leave? Yes.
I think it's very disappointing. Because we are a major contributor to the country, and so Germany for some more funding to keep the thing going. But my feeling is perhaps it might actually encourage other parts of the EU to think hard about the democratic deficiencies within the EU. I like you, I don't say like you, but assume that you're very much more my wavelength. Whether it will be referendum on this treaty or the constitution as it was, I think Netherlands voted against it, France voted against it, and they were ignored. And I just think if we left, it could be a bit of a wake-up call to the other members of the EU that they've got to be a little bit more sensitive. But I'm only speculating because I don't know.
Thank you very much. Yes, gentleman with the hand up. The microphone is just, if you can lean over and get it, that's good.
Hello, yes, Ruth, I'm a great fan of yours. I've come all the way down from Warwickshire just to hear you, so I don't mind the other two not being here so much. I'd like to ask you about the referendum. In my opinion, the referendum is a bit of a charade or a sham. I think what will happen is, if we vote to stay, we will stay. And if we vote to leave, we'll be told to carry on voting until we vote to stay. Do you agree with that?
No. I think if we vote to stay, we will stay, but the issue will not go away. I don't think the issue will go away at all. The Scottish independence doesn't go away. But if there's a Brexit vote, it's a majority of Brexit, I could not possibly see the British government ignore it. I don't know, what do you think about it?
Well, I see government after government in Europe ignore votes with support. Well, I haven't got as much confidence in the people that hold office in this country as I may have done in the past. And I do think there is a real risk that if the withdrawal vote is now on, that we will find, instead of the Article 50 discussions starting, that Mr. Cameron will return to Brussels and start having some further negotiations so that there can be a second vote.
Well, he said not.
Next question. Yes, gentleman just there. The microphone is just by you.
You say about the need for information to people, and a major plank of Project Fear is the loss of jobs, the 3 million argument, which is rubbish, as we know. They say for most politicians are still reciting that 3 million jobs will be lost if we leave. I've done it on a bit of that, but you've probably got a lot more resources. We need a list of an idea of how many jobs the EU has caused to go. Now you've got fishing, those jobs were renewable because people's sons and daughters went into them. They were community based, so they were ongoing jobs. They weren't, technology based that became obsolete. You've got David Campbell Bannerman said to me about the Temporary Workers Directive. He reckoned that was 100,000 jobs. So I do think in the promotion or the literature or whatever, there needs to be a kind of a tariff, a tally of all the jobs and we're currently with that in steel, whereas steel's, Germany's subsidising in steel, and we're told that we can't. So, and I'll just finally say, I'm a small business owner, so don't start with employment regulation, obviously. But I've pretty much given up employing people, and there is no talent. There's no one's done a part of how many people have had it up to here. We've been, really second class. When you employ someone, it's to actually to get a job done, and we seem to have Whitehall rules. It's just gone beyond the pale now. That there's a lot of people that. So if we do achieve Brexit, we're still going to have to keep Whitehall. There's a lot of work to be done after Brexit.
Thank you.
Well, I agree with that.
Good.
But as I said, when we leave, if we leave, then we'll be able to amend and repeal the regulations we think are particularly urgent. As for steel, well, it's partly because of our student energy loss. And we adopted that ourselves. We made it 100%.
Sometimes it's not all right.
Well, we've got both of our next speakers have now arrived. They're both in the